The shot rang out across the dusty street of Ventura, California, and Grace Campbell threw herself behind the water trough as splinters of wood exploded from the hitching post beside her. It was August 1883, and she had exactly 3 seconds to decide whether to run for the mercantile or stay put, while 2 drunken ranch hands settled their dispute about who had cheated at cards. She chose to stay low, her heart hammering against her ribs, her dark hair coming loose from its careful pins. What she did not know was that 2 men were watching her from different vantage points, and both were already moving to help her, their boots hitting the boardwalk at nearly the same instant. Garrett Jensen reached her first, vaulting over the trough with the kind of reckless speed that had earned him his reputation as the best bronc rider in Ventura County. He was 24, broad-shouldered, with sun-streaked brown hair and eyes the color of honey in sunlight. His younger brother Gideon was right behind him, coming from the opposite direction, his darker coloring and more cautious movements a contrast to Garrett's impulsiveness. Gideon was 22, quieter, with thoughtful gray eyes and the kind of patience that came from being the second son who had learned to wait his turn for everything. "Get to the store," Garrett said, his hand on Grace's elbow already pulling her up. "Gideon and I will handle this." Grace looked between the 2 brothers, both of whom had positioned themselves between her and the ongoing chaos in the street. She had known them for 3 months, ever since she had arrived in Ventura to help her Aunt Emma run the boarding house after her uncle had passed. The Jensen brothers worked the neighboring ranch, and they came to town every Saturday without fail. They were unfailingly polite, hardworking, and lately, both had been finding excuses to stop by the boarding house more frequently than necessary. "I can manage myself," Grace said, but her voice lacked conviction because another shot fired and she flinched despite herself. "Not arguing about that," Gideon said, his voice calmer than his brother's. "But let us handle the idiots and you get somewhere safe, please." The please did it. Grace nodded and ran for the mercantile, her skirts hiked up enough that she could move quickly. Behind her, she heard Garrett's commanding voice cutting through the commotion, and then Gideon's steadier tone backing him up. By the time she reached the store and looked back, the shooting had stopped, and the 2 ranch hands were being marched toward the sheriff's office by the Jensen brothers. She pressed her hand to her chest, trying to calm her breathing, and Mrs. Henderson, the mercantile owner, handed her a dipper of water. "Those Jensen boys are good men," Mrs. Henderson said, her weathered face creasing into a knowing smile. "Both of them sweet on you if I am reading the signs right." Grace drank the water to avoid answering, but her cheeks flushed warm. She had noticed the attention. How could she not? Garrett brought her wildflowers every time he came to town, always with some self-deprecating joke about how they probably were not as pretty as the ones back in Virginia, where she had grown up. Gideon brought her books, somehow knowing that she missed reading most of all in this rough frontier town, and he never made a fuss about it, just left them with her aunt with a quiet message that he thought Grace might enjoy them. They were both good men. That was the problem. If one had been a scoundrel and the other decent, the choice would have been easy. But they were both kind, both hardworking, both honest. Garrett made her laugh with his easy charm and adventurous spirit. Gideon made her think with his quiet intelligence and steady presence. And increasingly, she found herself watching for both of them, her heart doing a confused little leap whenever either one appeared. She finished her errands quickly and returned to the boarding house, where her aunt was kneading bread dough with the efficient movements of someone who had been doing it for 30 years. "I heard there was trouble in town," Aunt Emma said without looking up. "Nothing serious. Some drunk cowboys." The Jensen brothers helped, both of them, I imagine. Her aunt's tone was dry. "Those two have been circling you like bees around the only flower in the garden." "Aunt Emma, I am old enough to speak plainly, girl. You need to make a choice before this gets complicated. How can I choose?" Grace said, the words bursting out before she could stop them. "They are both wonderful. They are both everything a woman could want. How am I supposed to pick one and break the other's heart?" Emma wiped her flour-dusted hands on her apron and fixed Grace with a shrewd look. "You will know when the time comes. Real love is not about making lists of good qualities. It is about who you cannot imagine your life without." But the words did not help, because Grace was beginning to realize she could not imagine her life without either of them. The next week brought the annual Ventura County Fair, and Grace found herself being escorted by both Jensen brothers, one on each side as they walked through the crowds. It should have been awkward, but somehow it was not. Garrett kept up a running commentary that had her giggling, pointing out the fattest pig and the most ridiculous hat, and doing an impression of the bank manager that was so accurate she had to shush him before someone overheard. Gideon bought her lemonade and won her a blue ribbon at the shooting gallery, his steady hands making it look effortless. As the sun set and the dancing began in the town square, Grace found herself facing an impossible situation. Both brothers stood before her, and both were clearly working up the courage to ask her to dance. Garrett spoke first, his natural boldness winning out. "Grace, would you do me the honor?" But before she could answer, Gideon stepped forward. "I was about to ask the same thing." The air between the three of them went tense. Grace saw the muscle jump in Garrett's jaw, saw the way Gideon's hands clenched at his sides. These were brothers who loved each other, who had worked side by side their entire lives, who had never let a woman come between them. Until now. "I will dance with both of you," Grace said quickly. "One dance each." "That is fair, is not it?" they agreed, though neither looked happy about it. She danced first with Garrett, who held her perhaps a bit closer than was strictly proper and whispered in her ear about how beautiful she looked in the lamplight. Then she danced with Gideon, whose lead was smoother and who said nothing at all, just looked at her with those steady gray eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. When the music ended, she excused herself, claiming exhaustion, and walked back to the boarding house alone. She needed space to think, to breathe, to figure out what she was going to do. But the universe, it seemed, had other plans. The next morning, Grace woke to find her aunt feverish and weak. The doctor diagnosed pneumonia and said the next few days would be critical. Grace threw herself into nursing her aunt, barely sleeping, forcing broth and water between Emma's cracked lips, changing sweat-soaked sheets, and praying harder than she had prayed in years. The Jensen brothers showed up on the second day. Both of them. "We heard Miss Emma was sick," Garrett said, hat in hand. "We have come to help." "There is nothing you can do," Grace said, exhausted and frightened. "I am managing." "You cannot manage alone," Gideon said quietly. "Let us help, please." And so they did. They took turns chopping wood, hauling water, and keeping the boarding house running while Grace focused on her aunt. They were careful never to leave Grace alone with just one of them, always maintaining the triangle that had become their strange arrangement. Grace was too tired and too worried to think about the implications. On the fifth day, Emma's fever broke. The doctor declared her out of danger, and Grace finally allowed herself to collapse into a chair and weep with relief. When she looked up, both brothers were there, and both looked like they wanted to comfort her but were holding back because the other was present. "Thank you," she whispered. "Both of you. I could not have done this without you." "You do not need to thank us," Garrett said. "We would do anything for you," Gideon added, and the way he said it made Grace's breath catch. That night, after the brothers had left and Emma was sleeping peacefully, Grace sat by the window and stared out at the California stars. She was 21 years old and she was in love. The problem was, she was in love with two men, and she had no idea how to choose between them. The choice, however, was about to be made for her in a way she never could have anticipated. It started 2 weeks later when the Jensen brothers' father had a stroke. Grace heard about it from Mrs. Henderson and immediately went to their ranch with a basket of food and offers of help. She found the place in controlled chaos. The father, Thomas Jensen, was paralyzed on his left side and unable to speak clearly. The doctor said he might recover some function, but he would never be able to run the ranch again, which meant Garrett and Gideon would have to do it, together, and they would need help. Grace started visiting the ranch regularly, helping with the cooking and the household tasks that had fallen apart without a woman's touch since their mother had died 5 years ago. She watched the brothers work together with the kind of seamless coordination that came from a lifetime of partnership. Garrett handled the horses and the more physical labor. Gideon managed the books and the business dealings. They complemented each other perfectly. And they were both still courting her, though now with a kind of desperate urgency because they knew something had to give. It came to a head on a September evening when Grace was leaving the ranch. Both brothers walked her to her wagon, and Garrett, in his typical impulsive fashion, just blurted it out. "Grace, I love you. I have loved you since the first day I saw you, and I cannot keep pretending otherwise. I want to marry you. I want to build a life with you." I know Gideon feels the same way, and I know this is tearing you apart, but I had to say it. I had to tell you the truth. Gideon went very still, and then he nodded slowly. "He is right, about all of it. I love you too, Grace. I think I have loved you from the moment you told off that drunk who was bothering Mrs. Henderson. You are brave and kind and smart, and I cannot imagine my life without you in it." Grace stood between them, her heart breaking into pieces. "I love you both," she whispered. "That is the truth. I love you both, and I do not know how to choose." "Then do not," Garrett said wildly. "We will figure something out. We will share your time. We will—" "That is not a life," Gideon interrupted, his voice rough. "Grace deserves better than to be pulled between us forever. She deserves a husband who can give her all of himself, not half." "So what do you suggest?" Garrett demanded, turning on his brother. "We flip a coin, we fight for her." "What I suggest," Gideon said slowly, "that we let her choose, really choose. And whichever one of us she does not pick has to step back, completely. No lingering, no hoping, no making this harder than it has to be." "You make it sound easy," Garrett said bitterly. "It will be the hardest thing either of us ever does," Gideon replied. "But we love her. Which means we want what is best for her, not what is best for us." Grace looked between them, tears streaming down her face. "I need time," she said. "Please. I cannot decide right now. I need time to think." They gave her a week. 7 days to make a choice that would change all their lives forever. Grace spent that week in a state of misery. She made lists. She prayed. She talked to her aunt, who was recovering well but who refused to give advice beyond, "Follow your heart, dear." She walked the streets of Ventura until she knew every crack in the boardwalk. And still, she could not decide. Garrett was fire and passion. When she imagined a life with him, she saw adventure and laughter and children who would inherit his fearlessness. She saw spontaneous picnics and midnight rides, and a love that would burn bright and constant. Gideon was earth and steadiness. When she imagined a life with him, she saw quiet evenings reading together and thoughtful conversations and a partnership built on mutual respect. She saw a garden they would plant together and children who would inherit his wisdom, and a love that would grow deeper with every passing year. How could she choose? How could anyone choose? The night before she was supposed to give them her answer, Grace sat in her room at the boarding house and stared at the two books on her nightstand. One was a volume of poetry Gideon had given her. The other was a wildflower pressed between the pages of her Bible from Garrett. She picked up the poetry book and opened it randomly, looking for some kind of sign. The poem was about sacrifice, about loving someone enough to let them go. Grace closed the book slowly, her hands shaking. She knew what she had to do. She knew, even though it would break her heart. Because the truth was, she loved them both equally, which meant the decision could not be about who she loved more. It had to be about something else entirely. The next day, she rode out to the Jensen ranch with her decision made. Both brothers were waiting for her on the porch, their faces tense. Their father was visible through the window, watching with keen eyes even if he could not speak. Grace dismounted and walked up to them, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "I have thought about this from every possible angle," she said, her voice steady even though she felt like she was breaking inside. "And I have realized something. I cannot choose between you, not because I love you equally, though I do, but because any choice I make would hurt one of you, and that would hurt me, and that would hurt all of us." "So what are you saying?" Garrett asked, his voice hoarse. "I am saying I cannot marry either of you. I am saying I release you both from this impossible situation. I am saying I will leave Ventura and go back to Virginia, and you can both find women who can love you without reservations, without this constant shadow of what might have been." "No," Garrett said immediately. "No, that is not acceptable. You cannot just leave." "She can if she wants to," Gideon said quietly, and Grace saw something in his eyes, some deep pain and understanding. "If that is what will make you happy, Grace, then we will not stand in your way." "It will not make me happy," Grace said, the tears finally coming. "But I do not see another choice." She turned to leave, but Gideon caught her hand. "Wait," he said. "There is another choice. Let me make it for you." "What?" Grace turned back, confused. Gideon looked at his brother, and something passed between them, some wordless communication born of years as brothers. Then Gideon turned back to Grace and said the words that would change everything. "Marry Garrett." The silence that followed was absolute. Garrett stared at his brother like he had lost his mind. Grace felt the world tilt under her feet. "What are you talking about?" Garrett demanded. "I am talking about stepping back," Gideon said, and his voice was calm but his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I am talking about loving Grace enough to want her to be happy, even if it is not with me. You are the better choice for her, Garrett. You will give her the kind of passionate, exciting life she deserves. You will make her laugh every day. You will give her adventures and romance and all the things a young woman dreams about." "That is insane," Garrett said. "You love her as much as I do." "Exactly," Gideon said, "which is why I can do this. Because I love her enough to want what is best for her, even if it kills me." "And you are what is best for her." "No," Grace said, finding her voice. "Gideon, you cannot do this. You cannot just sacrifice yourself. That is not love, that is martyrdom." "Is it?" Gideon asked, looking at her directly. "Or is it the truest form of love there is? Putting someone else's happiness above your own." He reached out and took both of Grace's hands in his. "I have watched you with Garrett. I have seen the way you light up when he makes you laugh. I have seen the way you lean into his energy, his joy. You love me, I know you do. But you need him in a way you do not need me. And I would rather see you happy with my brother than watch you slowly dim trying to choose." "But what about you?" Grace whispered. "I will be all right," Gideon said, and it was possibly the bravest lie Grace had ever heard. "The ranch needs me. Father needs me, and knowing you are happy will be enough." Garrett looked stricken. "Gid, I cannot do this. I cannot take her from you. We are brothers." "Which is exactly why you can," Gideon said. "Because I trust you to love her the way she deserves to be loved. I trust you to take care of her. And I trust that someday I will be able to stand at your wedding and be happy for you both without wanting to die inside." He released Grace's hands and stepped back, physically creating distance. "Marry him, Grace. Make him the happiest man in California. Have beautiful children and build a beautiful life. And let me do this one thing for both of you. Let me give you this gift." Grace wanted to argue, wanted to refuse, wanted to insist that this was not right or fair. But when she looked at Garrett, she saw the hope and love and desperate longing in his face, and she realized that Gideon was right. She did need Garrett in a way that was different from how she needed Gideon. She loved them both, but the love she felt for Garrett was the kind that demanded expression, that needed the daily closeness of marriage. The love she felt for Gideon was real and deep, but it was also the kind that could, perhaps, transform into something else over time. The love of family. Of deep friendship. "Are you sure?" she asked Gideon, giving him one last chance to take it back. "I have never been more sure of anything in my life," he said, and she believed him. So Grace turned to Garrett and said, "Ask me." Garrett looked at his brother one more time, received a small nod, and then dropped to one knee in the dirt of his family's ranch. "Grace Campbell, will you marry me? Will you let me spend the rest of my life trying to make you as happy as you make me?" "Yes," Grace whispered. "Yes, I will marry you." Garrett stood and kissed her, right there in front of his brother and his father and God and everyone, and Grace kissed him back and tried not to think about the fact that Gideon had already turned and walked away, his shoulders rigid with the effort of not breaking down. The wedding was planned for October, giving Emma enough time to fully recover and help with the preparations. Gideon threw himself into ranch work with almost manic energy, spending 14-hour days in the saddle, coming home exhausted enough that he could fall into dreamless sleep without lying awake thinking about what he had given up. Grace tried to talk to him several times, but he was always polite and distant, treating her like a cherished future sister-in-law and nothing more. It hurt worse than if he had been angry or bitter. His kindness was a constant reminder of why she had loved him in the first place. Garrett, for his part, tried to make it up to his brother in 1,000 small ways. He took over the early morning shifts. He made sure Gideon got the better horse for the cattle drive. He talked about maybe building a second house on the property so Gideon could have his own space when he eventually found a wife of his own. He was trying so hard to make things right, but all three of them knew that some things could not be fixed, only endured. 3 weeks before the wedding, Grace was at the ranch helping to alter their mother's wedding dress when a rider came galloping up to the house. It was young Tommy Parker from the neighboring ranch, and he was nearly incoherent with panic. "It is Gideon," he gasped out. "There was an accident. He is trapped under a fallen horse in the canyon. Garrett is with him, but they need help. They need the doctor." Grace felt her heart stop. She did not even think, just hiked up her skirts and climbed onto Tommy's horse behind him. "Get me there," she commanded. "Now." They rode hard, and Grace had Tommy drop her at the canyon while he continued on to fetch the doctor. She scrambled down the rocky slope, heedless of her torn dress and scraped hands, until she found them. Gideon was lying on the ground, his face gray with pain. His left leg was bent at an unnatural angle, clearly broken. Garrett was beside him, his shirt torn and bloodied from where he had tried to dig his brother out from under the horse, which now lay dead a few feet away. "Grace," Garrett said, his voice cracking with relief. "Thank God. I could not leave him to get help. I could not." "It is all right," Grace said, dropping to her knees beside Gideon. "I am here now. The doctor is coming." Gideon's eyes were hazy with pain, but they focused on her face. "Thought I told you to marry my brother, not worry about me," he said, attempting a smile. "Shut up," Grace said, her hands running over him, checking for other injuries. "Save your strength." "Bossy," Gideon murmured. "Garrett, you are in for a lifetime of being bossed around." "I would not have it any other way," Garrett said, but his voice was thick with tears. "Gid, I am so sorry. The horse spooked and I tried to grab the reins, but I was too slow and you jumped to help, and not your fault," Gideon said. "Horse was just scared. Could have happened to anyone." But Grace saw the way Garrett was looking at his brother, saw the guilt and fear written all over his face. She reached out and gripped his hand. "This was not your fault," she said firmly. "Do you hear me? This was an accident." The doctor arrived and confirmed that the leg was badly broken, but that Gideon would survive if infection did not set in. They got him back to the ranch house and set the bone, and Gideon passed out from the pain, which was probably a mercy. For the next week, Grace spent more time at the Jensen ranch than at the boarding house. She sat with Gideon through his fever, changed his bandages, and forced him to eat even when he said he was not hungry. Garrett was there too, a constant worried presence, but he had to keep the ranch running. So Grace often found herself alone with Gideon in the quiet hours of the afternoon. On the 8th day, when Gideon's fever had broken and the doctor had pronounced him out of danger, Grace was sitting beside his bed reading when Gideon spoke. "You should not be here this much," he said quietly. "People will talk." "Let them talk," Grace said without looking up from her book. "You are going to be my brother. I am allowed to care about you." "Is that what I am to you now?" Gideon asked. "Your brother." Grace finally looked up, and the expression on Gideon's face made her chest ache. "What else can you be?" she asked softly. "You gave me to Garrett. You stepped back." "I did," Gideon agreed, "and I would do it again. But it does not change how I feel about you, Grace. It just changes what I am allowed to do about it." "Gideon, let me say this," he interrupted. "Please, I need to say it once and then I will never say it again. I love you. I will always love you, and watching you marry my brother is going to be the hardest thing I ever do. But I will do it with a smile on my face because your happiness matters more to me than my own. That is what real love is, Grace. It is not about possession or need. It is about wanting the best for someone even when it breaks you." Grace felt tears slip down her cheeks. "I wish there was another way." "There is not," Gideon said simply. "And that is all right. Some love stories do not end with the couple together. Some end with letting go. Mine is one of those." "Does it get easier?" Grace whispered. "I do not know yet," Gideon said honestly. "Ask me in 50 years. The wedding took place on a beautiful October morning. The whole town of Ventura turned out to watch. Garrett looked handsome in his best suit, his face lit up with joy and love. Aunt Emma cried happy tears. And Gideon stood beside his brother as best man, his expression calm and proud, betraying nothing of the cost of his presence there. When the minister asked if anyone objected, there was a moment of held breath. Gideon could have spoken. He could have claimed her. He could have broken the careful facade and admitted that he loved her too, that his sacrifice was killing him, that he wanted her for himself. He said nothing. He just met Grace's eyes across the small space and nodded slightly, giving her his blessing one final time. Grace married Garrett Jensen on October 15, 1883, and she promised to love and honor him for the rest of her life. And she meant it. She did love Garrett, wholly and completely. But as they exchanged their vows, she was acutely aware of Gideon standing just behind his brother, and she wondered if she would spend the rest of her life carrying the weight of his sacrifice. The reception was held at the boarding house, and it was a joyful affair full of music and dancing and enough food to feed half the county. Garrett never left Grace's side, his hand always at her waist, his smile bright and constant. He was blissfully, transparently happy, and Grace let herself be caught up in that happiness. let herself forget for a few hours about the complicated tangle of emotions that had brought them to this point. Gideon danced with her once, the traditional dance between the bride and the best man. He held her properly, at her respectful distance, and he made light conversation about the quality of the punch and the size of the crowd. And when the dance was over, he bowed formally and stepped away, and Grace felt something inside her crack. That night, she went to the small house on the Jensen ranch that would now be her home. Garrett carried her over the threshold, laughing and kissing her, and Grace pushed aside all her complicated feelings and focused on the man who was now her husband. He loved her. She loved him. That had to be enough, and for a while it was. Married life with Garrett was everything Gideon had said it would be. It was laughter and adventure and passion. Garrett worked hard on the ranch but always made time for her. He took her on rides through the California hills. He brought her flowers for no reason. He made her laugh until she cried. He loved her with his whole heart, holding nothing back, and Gideon kept his distance. He was polite and friendly, but he was careful never to be alone with Grace, never to let a conversation linger too long, never to give any indication that his feelings were anything other than brotherly. He ate dinner with them most nights, because he still lived in the main ranch house with their father, but he excused himself early and spent his evenings alone. Grace ached for him, but she did not know what to do about it. She had made her choice. She was married. She was building a life with Garrett. She could not undo any of that, even if she wanted to. Which she did not. She did not. She loved Garrett. She was happy with Garrett. But at night, when Garrett was asleep beside her, Grace sometimes lay awake and thought about Gideon, alone in his room, and wondered what he was thinking. Wondered if he was happy. Wondered if he would ever find someone who could make him forget about her. Winter came to Ventura, which in California meant cooler temperatures and rain rather than snow. Grace discovered she was pregnant in January, and Garrett was over the moon with excitement. He immediately became overprotective, insisting she rest more, refusing to let her help with any heavy work. It was endearing and frustrating in equal measure. Gideon's reaction was more muted but no less genuine. "Congratulations," he said when they told him over dinner. "You will both make wonderful parents. You are going to be an uncle," Garrett said, grinning. "Our kid is going to think you are the best thing since sliced bread, just like I did when I was little." Something flickered across Gideon's face, too quick for Grace to read. "I hope so," he said quietly. "I will certainly try to be worthy of the honor." As Grace's pregnancy progressed, Gideon seemed to retreat even further. He took on more of the distant ranch work, spending days at a time in the line shacks, checking on cattle in the far pastures. Garrett worried about him, but Gideon always insisted he was fine, just busy with the ranch. Grace knew better. Gideon was running, putting physical distance between himself and the daily reminder of what he had given up, and she could not blame him for it, even though his absence left a hole in their little household that everyone could feel. The baby came in late summer, a healthy boy they named Gabriel. He had Garrett's golden coloring and Grace's dark eyes, and he was loud and energetic from the moment he entered the world. Garrett was a doting father, constantly holding his son, showing him off to anyone who would look, talking to him in a silly voice that made Grace laugh. Gideon came to meet his nephew 3 days after the birth. He stood in the doorway of their bedroom, holding his hat, looking uncertain in a way Grace had never seen before. "Come in," Grace said softly. "Come meet Gabriel." Gideon approached slowly and looked down at the baby in Grace's arms. His expression transformed, softening into something so tender that Grace had to look away. "He is perfect," Gideon said. "He looks just like you both." "Want to hold him?" Garrett asked, Already reaching to take the baby, Gideon hesitated, then carefully took Gabriel into his arms. The baby looked impossibly tiny against Gideon's broad chest. Gideon gazed down at him with an expression of such profound longing that Grace felt tears prick her eyes. "Hello, Gabriel," Gideon said quietly. "I am your Uncle Gideon. I am going to teach you how to ride and rope and read, and I am going to spoil you rotten whenever your parents are not looking." Gabriel yawned, unimpressed, and everyone laughed. But when Gideon handed the baby back, Grace saw the way his hands lingered, the way he had to force himself to step away. This should have been his child too, Grace thought suddenly. If things had been different, he would be the father, and Garrett would be the uncle, and who knew how different all their lives would have been. Life settled into a rhythm over the next year. Gabriel grew from a baby into a toddler, learning to walk by pulling himself up on anything he could reach, babbling constantly in a language only he understood. Garrett's father, Thomas, continued to improve slowly, regaining some mobility and speech, though he would never fully recover. The ranch prospered under the brothers' joint management, and Gideon remained distant, kind but separate, a beloved uncle but nothing more. It was not sustainable, Grace realized. Something had to change. The change came in the form of Sarah Mitchell, a widow who moved to Ventura in the spring of 1885. She was 28, with red hair and green eyes and a quick wit. She had lost her husband to cholera 2 years earlier and was starting over, opening a dress shop in town. She was smart and independent and beautiful, and half the unmarried men in Ventura started courting her within a week of her arrival, including, Grace noticed with a mixture of hope and something that felt uncomfortably like jealousy, Gideon. Grace first saw them together at church. Gideon was helping Sarah carry her supplies back to her shop, and they were talking and laughing in a way that made Grace's chest tighten. She told herself she was being ridiculous. She was married. She had a child. She had a good life. She had no right to feel anything about Gideon courting another woman, but telling herself that and actually believing it were two different things. "I think Gideon is sweet on Mrs. Mitchell," Garrett said that night as they were getting ready for bed. "Good for him. He deserves to be happy." "Yes," Grace agreed, forcing enthusiasm into her voice. "He does. Maybe if he gets married, he will finally stop working himself to death out on the range," Garrett continued, not noticing Grace's strained tone. "Maybe he will finally build that house we have been talking about and start a family of his own." "Maybe," Grace said, and changed the subject. Over the next few months, Gideon's courtship of Sarah progressed. He took her to dances. He had dinner at her house. He brought her to the ranch to meet the family. Sarah was lovely, and she clearly adored Gideon, and Grace tried very hard to be happy for them. But late at night, when she was feeding Gabriel or soothing him back to sleep, Grace found herself thinking about Gideon with an intensity that frightened her. She had married Garrett. She had chosen Garrett. She had built a life with Garrett, and she loved him, truly loved him. But some part of her had never fully let go of Gideon, had never stopped wondering what might have been. It came to a head on a warm June evening. Sarah was visiting the ranch for dinner, and Grace was serving dessert when Gabriel, who was playing on the floor, reached up for Gideon with both arms, demanding to be picked up. Gideon obliged, settling the toddler on his lap, and Gabriel immediately grabbed Gideon's nose, giggling. "He loves you," Sarah said, smiling at the picture they made. "The feeling is mutual," Gideon said, tickling Gabriel's belly. "This kid is the best thing that ever happened to this family." Grace watched them, and something inside her broke, because Gabriel should have been Gideon's. In another world, in another life, Gideon would have been the father, and Grace would have been the mother, and they would have been the family. And Gideon had given all of that up, because he loved her enough to let her go. She excused herself abruptly and fled to the kitchen, pressing her hands to her face, trying to steady her breathing. She heard footsteps behind her and assumed it was Garrett, but when she turned, it was Gideon. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. "Fine," Grace lied. "Just tired, Grace." His voice was gentle but firm. "Talk to me." "I cannot," she whispered. "I am married to your brother. I cannot talk to you about this." "About what?" Gideon asked, though his eyes said he already knew. "About the fact that watching you with Sarah makes me want to scream," Grace admitted, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "About the fact that I chose Garrett and I love Garrett, but I never stopped loving you. About the fact that I see you with my son, and I think about how he could have been our son, and it makes me feel like I am being torn in half. I cannot talk to you about any of that because it is not fair to you or to Garrett or to me." The silence that followed was devastating. Then Gideon said, very carefully, "You need to forget I exist, Grace. You need to put whatever you feel for me in a box and bury it deep. Because you are right. It is not fair to any of us, and I will not be the cause of your marriage falling apart." "Are you going to marry her?" Grace asked. "Sarah, I am thinking about it," Gideon said. "She is a good woman. She deserves a husband who can love her completely." "Can you?" Grace asked. "Love her completely?" Gideon met her eyes. "I am trying to. Every day I am trying to." "That is not the same thing." "No," Gideon agreed. "But it is all I have to offer." He turned to leave, then stopped. "For what it is worth, I think I did the right thing. Stepping back, I mean. You and Garrett are good together. You make each other happy. Gabriel is thriving. You have built a beautiful life. And someday, maybe, I will be able to look at all of that and not feel like I am bleeding from a wound that will not close. But until then, I am going to keep trying. And I need you to let me. Please." Grace nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Gideon left, and Grace stood alone in the kitchen, tears streaming down her face, mourning a love that could never be. She pulled herself together before rejoining the others. Garrett was playing with Gabriel, making him laugh with exaggerated faces. Sarah was watching with an indulgent smile. Gideon was carving more pie, his expression carefully neutral. It was a perfect domestic scene, and Grace felt like an outsider in her own life. That night, after everyone had left and Gabriel was asleep, Garrett pulled Grace into his arms. "I love you," he said, kissing her forehead. "I love you so much. You know that, right?" "I know," Grace said, holding him tight. "I love you too." And it was true. She did love Garrett. The problem was, she also loved Gideon, and no amount of trying seemed to change that. Summer turned to fall, and Gideon continued courting Sarah. Garrett and Grace continued raising Gabriel and running the ranch. Thomas Jensen continued his slow recovery, now able to walk with a cane and speak in full sentences, though he tired easily. Everything continued, steady and unchanging, like a wheel rolling forward on a track it could not leave. Then, in November, Sarah accepted a marriage proposal. Not from Gideon, but from a merchant from San Francisco who had been courting her by mail. She came to the ranch to tell Gideon herself, apologizing but explaining that the merchant could offer her stability and a life in the city, which she had missed since leaving her home back east. Gideon took it well, at least outwardly. He wished her every happiness and said all the right things. But after she left, Grace found him in the barn, standing in the shadows, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. She should have left him alone. She knew she should have, but she could not. "Gideon," she said softly, approaching him. He wiped his face quickly, trying to compose himself. "I am fine," he said, his voice rough. "Just disappointed, that is all." "It is all right to be more than disappointed," Grace said. "It is all right to be hurt." "I am not hurt about Sarah," Gideon said, and then he laughed bitterly. "That is the worst part." I barely even care that she is marrying someone else. I was trying so hard to love her and I just could not, because I am still in love with you, Grace. 2 years later, and I am still in love with you, and I do not know how to stop. Grace felt like her heart was being squeezed in a vice. Gideon, I know, he said, holding up a hand. I know, you are married, you love Garrett, I need to move on. I have heard it all before, including from myself. But apparently my heart did not get the message. Grace made a decision in that moment, a decision that was probably unwise but felt necessary. She crossed the distance between them and hugged him, wrapping her arms around his waist and holding him tight. After a moment of surprised stillness, Gideon hugged her back, burying his face in her hair. They stood like that for a long time, not speaking, just holding each other. It was not romantic. It was not passionate. It was just two people who loved each other, offering comfort in the only way they could. When they finally pulled apart, Gideon said quietly, "Thank you." For what? For caring, for not pretending this is easy, for being honest with me. It is the least I can do, Grace said, after everything you have given up. I told you before, Gideon said. I would do it again. Seeing you happy is worth it. Am I happy? Grace asked. Because sometimes I am not sure anymore. Gideon cupped her face gently, his thumb brushing away a tear she had not realized was falling. You are happy with Garrett, he said firmly. You have a beautiful son and a good life. Do not let my foolish heart convince you otherwise. He dropped his hand and stepped back, re-establishing the distance between them. I think I am going to leave for a while, he said. Maybe go up north, visit some of the ranches in Oregon, clear my head. Garrett can manage things here, especially with Father doing so much better. How long will you be gone? Grace asked, trying to keep the panic out of her voice. I do not know, Gideon said honestly. As long as it takes. He left 3 days later and the ranch felt empty without him. Garrett worried about his brother traveling alone, but he understood the need. Sometimes a man just needs to ride, he told Grace. Gideon will come back when he is ready. But weeks turned into months and there was no word from Gideon. Christmas came and went. Gabriel's second birthday arrived. Spring returned to California. And still, Gideon did not come home. Grace threw herself into ranch life and motherhood, trying not to think about where Gideon might be or whether he was all right. Garrett never said anything, but Grace could see the worry in his eyes every time a rider approached, hoping it would be his brother. Finally, in April of 1886, Gideon returned. He rode up to the ranch looking thinner and sun-weathered, but there was something different about him, something calmer. He dismounted and hugged his brother, and Grace, and kissed Gabriel on the forehead, and announced that he had bought property up north near the Oregon border. I am going to start my own ranch, he said over dinner that night. Smaller than this one, but mine. I need my own place, my own life. I cannot keep living in the shadow of what might have been. But we need you here, Garrett protested. The ranch will be fine, Gideon interrupted gently. You have always been the better rancher, Garrett. You know it, I know it. And Father is almost back to full strength. You do not need me. But we want you, Grace said, the words coming out before she could stop them. Gideon looked at her and his eyes were sad but resolute. I know, but I need to do this. For my own sanity, I will visit. You will visit me. We will still be family. But I cannot stay here and watch you build a life that I will always wish was partly mine. It is not fair to any of us. Grace wanted to argue, wanted to beg him to stay, but she knew he was right. This half-life they had been living, with Gideon close but forever distant, was slowly destroying all of them. Maybe distance would help. Maybe time and space would finally allow the wounds to heal. When do you leave? Garrett asked quietly. 2 weeks, Gideon said. I need to pack up my things and say my goodbyes. Those 2 weeks were bittersweet. Gideon spent time with his father, teaching him the last few things he needed to know to fully manage the ranch again. He spent time with Gabriel, playing with the little boy for hours, as if trying to memorize every laugh and smile. He spent time with Garrett, riding the property one last time, talking about everything and nothing. And he spent time with Grace, though never alone, always with Garrett or Gabriel or Thomas nearby. They talked about books and California weather and Gabriel's latest antics. They avoided talking about feelings or the past or what might have been. It was surface level and polite and absolutely heartbreaking. The night before Gideon was scheduled to leave, Grace could not sleep. She got up quietly, careful not to wake Garrett, and went to sit on the porch. She was surprised to find Gideon already there, sitting on the steps, looking out at the dark landscape. "Could not sleep either?" he asked as she sat down beside him. "Too many thoughts," Grace admitted. They sat in comfortable silence for a while. Then Gideon said, "I want you to know something. The last 2 years, even though they have been the hardest of my life, I do not regret my decision." "I meant what I said, Grace. Seeing you happy with Garrett, watching Gabriel grow, knowing I gave you that even though it cost me everything, that is enough. It has to be enough." "You are the best man I have ever known," Grace said, her voice breaking. "And I am so sorry that loving me has caused you so much pain." "Do not be sorry," Gideon said. "Some people go their whole lives without feeling this kind of love. At least I know what it is. At least I had the privilege of loving you even if I could not have you." Grace felt tears streaming down her face. "I wish things were different." "So do I," Gideon said, "but they are not. And we have to live in the world we have, not the one we wish for." He stood and offered her his hand, pulling her to her feet. For a moment, they stood facing each other in the moonlight, and Grace thought he might kiss her. She thought she might let him. But instead, Gideon just hugged her one more time, holding her close and breathing her in like he was trying to memorize her. "Goodbye, Grace," he whispered. "Be happy, please, for me." "Goodbye, Gideon," she whispered back. "Find happiness too, promise me." "I promise to try," he said, which was the most honest answer he could give. The next morning, Gideon loaded his wagon and said his goodbyes. He shook his father's hand. He held Gabriel and whispered something in his ear that made the little boy giggle. He hugged his brother so tight that Garrett's eyes filled with tears. And he tipped his hat to Grace, not trusting himself to touch her again. Then he climbed onto his wagon and rode north, toward his new life, leaving behind everything he had ever known and loved. Grace watched until he was out of sight, Garrett's arm around her shoulders, Gabriel on her hip. And she realized that this was what true love looked like. Not the passionate, consuming kind that she shared with Garrett, but the selfless, sacrificial kind that Gideon had shown her. The kind that stepped back. The kind that let go. The kind that wanted someone else's happiness more than its own. Life went on as it always does. Gabriel grew into a bright, energetic child who looked more like his father every day. Grace had another baby in 1887, a daughter they named Georgia, who had her mother's dark eyes and her Uncle Gideon's quiet disposition. Garrett thrived as a rancher and a father, his joy in life infectious and constant. Thomas Jensen lived to see his grandchildren grow, finally passing peacefully in his sleep in 1889. Gideon visited once or twice a year, and they visited him up north. He had built a successful, if modest, ranch. He was well respected in his community. He seemed content, if not exactly happy. He never married, despite Grace's gentle pushing about various nice women she had heard about in his area. "I am fine as I am," he always said. "Some men are meant for marriage and family, some are meant to be alone." "You are not meant to be alone," Grace would argue. "Maybe not," Gideon would agree. "But it is what I have, and I am making the best of it." Years passed. Gabriel grew into a teenager who was all his father's boldness and adventurous spirit. Georgia grew into a thoughtful young girl who loved reading as much as her uncle Gideon did. Grace and Garrett's love deepened and matured, the wild passion of their youth settling into something steadier but no less real. And through it all, Grace carried the knowledge of Gideon's sacrifice. It shaped her, made her more compassionate, more aware of the complexity of love. She never spoke of it to anyone, not even Garrett, but she thought about it often. About the man who had loved her enough to step back. About the brother who had given his own happiness so his sibling could have his. In 1895, when Grace was 33 and Garrett was 36, they received word that Gideon had been injured in a ranching accident. A bull had gored him, and while he was expected to recover, he was asking for his family. They made the trip north immediately, bringing the children. They found Gideon in bed, bandaged and pale but conscious. He smiled when he saw them. "You did not have to come all this way," he said. "Of course we did," Garrett said gruffly. "You are family." Gideon stayed with them for 3 months while he recovered, unable to manage his ranch alone. It was the longest they had spent together since he had left 9 years earlier, and Grace realized something during that time. Gideon had kept his promise. He had found a kind of happiness, or at least peace. He was no longer the heartbroken young man who had stepped aside. He was someone who had built a good life despite his disappointments, who had found meaning in his work and his friendships and his role as uncle. One evening, while Garrett was putting the children to bed, Grace and Gideon sat on the porch, watching the sunset. "I have been thinking," Grace said, "about that day, 12 years ago, when you told me to marry Garrett. I have never thanked you properly." "You do not need to thank me," Gideon said. "Yes, I do," Grace insisted, "because you were right. Garrett and I are good together. We have built a beautiful life. And I do not think I could have done that if you had not loved me enough to let me go." Gideon was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I have a confession to make. For a long time I was angry, not at you, not at Garrett, but at the universe, at God, at fate. I was angry that I had done the right thing and it still hurt so much. I was angry that being selfless did not make the pain go away." "When did the anger stop?" Grace asked. "It has not completely," Gideon admitted, "but it has gotten quieter, and I have realized something. Love is not always about being together. Sometimes it is about wanting the best for someone, even when it breaks your heart. And I wanted the best for you, Grace. I still do. And the best for you was Garrett." "You could have been just as good," Grace said softly. "Maybe," Gideon said. "But we will never know, and I have made my peace with that." He turned to look at her, and his eyes were clear and calm. "I am all right, Grace. It took me a long time to get here, but I am all right, and you can stop worrying about me." "I am not sure I can do that," Grace said with a small smile. "Then at least worry less," Gideon said. "I promise you I have a good life. It is not the life I dreamed of when I was 22 and in love with my brother's girl, but it is a good life nonetheless." Grace reached out and took his hand, and for once, there was no undercurrent of longing or regret. Just affection and gratitude, and the deep bond of people who had weathered a storm together and come out the other side. Garrett came out then, and the 3 of them sat together and watched the stars come out, and Grace thought about how strange and complicated and beautiful life could be. Gideon eventually recovered and returned to his ranch. The visits continued, more frequent now, the children growing up knowing their uncle as a constant, loving presence in their lives. Gabriel, in particular, adored his Uncle Gideon and spent summers working on his ranch, learning about cattle and horses and the kind of patient wisdom that Gideon had in abundance. In 1898, when Gabriel was 15, he asked his uncle why he had never married. Gideon, who was teaching him to rope, paused and considered the question. "I loved someone once," he said finally, "and she loved me too, but she loved your father more and I wanted her to be happy, so I stepped back." "That is the saddest thing I have ever heard," Gabriel said. "Is it?" Gideon asked. "I do not think so. I think it is one of the best things I have ever done. Your mother is happy with your father. You and your sister exist because I made that choice. That does not seem sad to me. It seems like proof that sometimes the right thing is hard but worth it." Gabriel thought about that for a while. Then he said, "I want to be like you when I grow up, Uncle Gideon." "Why is that?" Gideon asked, surprised. "Because you are the bravest person I know," Gabriel said simply. "It is easy to be brave when you are fighting or taking risks. It is a lot harder to be brave enough to do the right thing when it costs you everything." Gideon felt something in his chest crack open, and he realized that maybe, just maybe, his sacrifice had not been for nothing. Not just because it had given Grace and Garrett their happiness, but because it had taught his nephew something about love and selflessness and what it meant to be a good man. "Thank you," Gideon said quietly. "That means more than you know." The years continued to pass. Gabriel grew into a fine young man who was a perfect blend of both his parents. Georgia grew into a beautiful young woman with her mother's strength and her uncle's thoughtful nature. Grace and Garrett grew old together, their love deepening into something comfortable and enduring. And Gideon remained a constant in all their lives, the uncle, the brother, the friend, the man who had stepped back and in doing so had proven the depth of his love. In 1905, Garrett fell ill. It started as a cough that would not go away and progressed into something more serious. The doctor diagnosed tuberculosis, and despite everyone's best efforts, Garrett continued to decline. He died in January of 1906, surrounded by his family with Grace holding his hand. Grace was devastated. For 22 years, Garrett had been her husband, her partner, the father of her children. They had built a life together, and now he was gone, and she did not know how to navigate the world without him. Gideon came to the funeral and stayed for weeks afterward, helping Grace settle Garrett's affairs, making sure the ranch could continue running, being a steady presence when everything else felt like it was falling apart. Gabriel, now 23 and fully capable, took over the running of the ranch. Georgia, at 19, stayed close to her mother, offering comfort and companionship. One evening, a few weeks after the funeral, Grace and Gideon were sitting in the parlor. The children had gone to bed and the house was quiet. "Thank you for being here," Grace said. "I do not know what I would have done without you." "You would have been fine," Gideon said. "You are the strongest person I know." "I do not feel strong," Grace admitted. "I feel broken." "Grief will do that," Gideon said gently. "But you will heal. Not all at once and not completely, but you will heal." Grace was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Do you ever wonder what might have been if you had not stepped back, if I had chosen you instead?" Gideon considered the question seriously. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But then I look at Gabriel and Georgia, and I think about how they would not exist if things had been different, and I think about how happy you and Garrett were together. And I realize that what might have been does not matter as much as what actually was." "I loved him so much," Grace whispered. "I know you did," Gideon said, "and he loved you. That is what matters." "I loved you too, you know," Grace said, looking directly at him. "I still do, just differently." "I know," Gideon said, "and I have always known. But the kind of love we had was not meant to be lived out in marriage and children. It was meant to be something else, something sacrificial and pure and lasting." "It has certainly lasted," Grace said with a sad smile. They sat together in comfortable silence, two people bound by a complicated history of love and loss and sacrifice. And Grace realized that even though Garrett was gone, she was not alone. She had her children, her ranch, her community. And she had Gideon, who had loved her enough to let her go and who had stayed in her life, faithful and constant, for more than 2 decades. Time, as always, moved forward. Grace eventually came to terms with her grief, though she never forgot Garrett or stopped missing him. Gabriel married a sweet girl from town and brought her to live on the ranch. Georgia married a banker and moved to Los Angeles, and Grace settled into the role of matriarch, grandmother, and keeper of family stories. Gideon continued to visit, less frequently now as they all grew older, but he was still a cherished presence. He was in his 60s, still working his ranch, still living alone, still carrying the quiet dignity that had defined his life. In 1920, when Grace was 58 and Gideon was 60, Grace made a decision. She had been thinking about it for months, and she finally worked up the courage to act on it. She traveled north to Gideon's ranch, bringing with her a letter she had written but never sent all those years ago. Gideon was surprised to see her but welcomed her warmly. They sat on his porch, drinking coffee and watching the Oregon landscape, so different from the California hills they had both grown up in. "I have something for you," Grace said, handing him the letter. Gideon opened it carefully and read the words she had written 37 years earlier, just before her wedding to Garrett. The letter thanked him for his sacrifice, told him how much she loved him, and promised to make Garrett happy, because that was the gift Gideon had given her. It was heartfelt and honest and full of the complicated emotions of a young woman in love with 2 men. When he finished reading, Gideon looked up at Grace with tears in his eyes. "Why did you never send this?" "Because I did not know how," Grace admitted. "Because I was afraid it would make everything harder, because I was young and confused and trying to do the right thing." "Thank you for showing it to me now," Gideon said quietly. "I want you to know something," Grace said. "Everything you did, everything you gave up, it mattered. You gave Garrett and me 22 wonderful years together. You gave us Gabriel and Georgia. You gave me a life I could not have imagined. And you did it all because you loved me enough to want my happiness more than your own. That is the purest form of love I have ever known, Gideon. And I wanted you to know that I never took it for granted. Not for one single day." Gideon reached out and took her hand, and they sat there, 2 old friends who had once been young and in love, who had walked the hardest road and come out the other side with their integrity intact. "I would do it again," Gideon said. "Every single bit of it, because you are right. Love is not always about possession. Sometimes it is about letting go. And I let you go because I loved you, and I would not change that for anything." Grace leaned her head on his shoulder, and they sat together as the sun set. 2 people who had loved each other in the most complicated and beautiful way possible. Grace lived to be 78, passing peacefully in her sleep in 1940. Gideon attended her funeral, an old man now but still standing tall, still carrying the quiet strength that had defined his life. He stood beside Gabriel and Georgia and told them stories about their mother and father, about the early days in Ventura, about how he had stepped back so that Grace could be happy. "You are the reason we exist," Georgia said, hugging her uncle. "You gave us our lives." "Your parents gave you your lives," Gideon corrected gently. "I just made it possible." Gideon lived another 5 years, dying at the age of 83 in 1945. He was buried in Oregon on his ranch, under the trees he had planted when he first arrived there 60 years earlier. At his funeral, Gabriel read from the letter Grace had shown Gideon that day in 1920, and he talked about the uncle who had taught him what real love looked like. Not the easy, passionate kind, but the hard, sacrificial kind. The kind that stepped back. The kind that let go. The kind that proved itself not in grand gestures, but in quiet faithfulness over decades. Gabriel and Georgia made sure the story was passed down through the generations. They told their children and grandchildren about the two brothers who had loved the same woman, and about how the one who stepped back had proven his love was deeper and truer than anyone could have imagined. They told the story not as a tragedy, but as a testament to the power of selfless love, the kind that puts someone else's happiness above its own. And in Ventura, California, where it had all begun so many years ago, the story became a kind of legend. The tale of Grace Campbell and the Jensen brothers, of a choice that could not be made and a sacrifice that proved what real love looked like. People told it to their children on warm summer evenings. Young couples thought about it when they faced their own difficult decisions. And old-timers would shake their heads and say that you did not see that kind of love anymore, the kind that was willing to step back and let go. But the truth was, that kind of love had always existed and always would. It existed in every person who put someone else's needs before their own. In every parent who sacrificed for their children. In every friend who stepped aside so someone else could shine. In every heart that loved deeply enough to let go. Gideon Jensen had proven that love was not always about holding on. Sometimes, the greatest love was in the letting go. And in doing so, he had given Grace Campbell and Garrett Jensen the gift of a lifetime together. He had given Gabriel and Georgia the gift of existence, and he had given the world an example of what true, selfless, sacrificial love looked like. In the end, everyone got their happily ever after, even if it was not the one they had originally imagined. Grace had her years with Garrett, filled with love and laughter and the family they built together. Garrett had the woman he loved and a life that exceeded his wildest dreams. Gabriel and Georgia grew up knowing they were cherished and raised families of their own. And Gideon had the satisfaction of knowing he had done the right thing, that his sacrifice had mattered, that his love had been pure and true even if it could never be fully realized. The ranch in Ventura continued to prosper under Gabriel's management and eventually passed to his children. The ranch in Oregon was sold after Gideon's death, but a marker remained, placed there by Gabriel and Georgia, that read, Gideon Jensen, the man who stepped back and proved he loved her more. And on warm California evenings, when the sun set over Ventura County and the hills turned gold in the fading light, you could almost imagine you saw them there, the three of them together. Garrett with his easy smile and boundless energy. Grace with her quiet strength and complicated heart. And Gideon, standing just slightly apart, watching over them both with the kind of love that transcends time and circumstance and the limitations of mortal life. Their story became part of the fabric of Ventura, woven into the history of the town alongside tales of cattle drives and gold rushes and all the other dramas of the Wild West. But unlike so many of those stories, which faded with time, the story of Grace and the Jensen brothers endured. Because it spoke to something fundamental about human nature, about the capacity for selfless love, about the choices we make, and the sacrifices we are willing to make for those we care about. In 1975, Gabriel's granddaughter wrote a book about the family history, based on letters and diaries that had been preserved through the generations. The book included the letter Grace had written but never sent, the diary entries where Gideon chronicled his struggle to let go, and Garrett's own words about his brother's sacrifice. It became a local bestseller and introduced a new generation to the story. Young readers were moved by the romance and the heartbreak. Older readers recognized the truth in it, the way love is rarely simple and often requires us to be better than we think we can be. And everyone agreed that Gideon Jensen had been a remarkable man. The kind of man who proved that true love is measured not in what you take, but in what you are willing to give up. The story of the two brothers who loved her, and she could not choose, and the cowboy who stepped back and proved he loved her more became a touchstone in Ventura. It was taught in local schools as an example of character and sacrifice. It was referenced in wedding toasts and anniversary celebrations. It was held up as proof that even in the rough and tumble world of the Wild West, there was room for the highest forms of love and nobility. And through it all, the central truth remained. Gideon had loved Grace enough to step back. He had put her happiness above his own. He had given his brother the gift of a lifetime with the woman they both loved. And in doing so, he had proven that love is not always about possession or fulfillment. Sometimes, love is about sacrifice, about letting go, about wanting someone else's happiness more than your own. That was the legacy of Gideon Jensen. Not the ranch he built, or the cattle he raised, or any of the material accomplishments of his life. His legacy was the choice he made on that dusty California afternoon in 1883, when he told Grace to marry his brother, and then stepped back to let them build their life together. That choice echoed through the generations, touching lives and inspiring hearts long after all the original players had passed from the stage. And if love can be measured by its lasting impact, by the lives it touches and the good it does in the world, then Gideon's love was perhaps the greatest of all, because it gave life to Gabriel and Georgia and all their descendants, because it made possible Grace and Garrett's happiness, because it showed the world what selfless love looks like in action. In the end, everyone in the story got what they needed, even if it was not always what they wanted. Grace got a husband who adored her and a family that brought her joy. Garrett got the woman he loved and a life beyond his dreams. Gabriel and Georgia got to exist, to live and love and pass on the story to their own children. And Gideon got the knowledge that his love had mattered, that his sacrifice had meaning, that he had done something noble and good and true. The Wild West was full of stories of gunslingers and outlaws, of gold rushes and cattle drives, of violence and adventure and dramatic showdowns. But the story of Grace Campbell and the Jensen brothers was different. It was a story about love in its purest form. About three good people caught in an impossible situation, who all tried to do the right thing. About a choice that could not be made, and a sacrifice that proved to be the greatest gift of all. And that story, more than any tale of shootouts or stampedes, captured the true heart of what it meant to be human in that time and place. Because beneath all the roughness and hardship of frontier life, there were still people capable of extraordinary love, of selfless sacrifice, of putting others before themselves. Gideon Jensen was one of those people. And his story and Grace's story and Garrett's story lived on long after they were gone, a testament to the enduring power of love that gives rather than takes, that steps back rather than demands, that proves itself not in possession but in sacrifice. And somewhere, perhaps in whatever comes after this life, the three of them finally found peace. Grace reunited with the husband she had loved for 22 years, Garrett welcoming her with that bright smile she had fallen in love with. And Gideon, standing to the side as always, watching them with quiet joy, knowing that his choice had been the right one, that his love had been true, and that in the end, love is measured not by what we keep, but by what we are willing to give away.